welcome to the Worship Collective podcast. Worship Collective exists to unify and enrich the church through worship education, outreach, and community. And we're really excited to finally be doing this. My name is Grubbs. I'm the president and program director for the Worship Collective, and
I'm Caleb. I am the next gen
You're the other
worship co-leader and the tech guy.
Good job. Way to figure that out. So we're here. We're finally doing the thing. We're gonna sit down and we're gonna have some conversations. You know, I mentioned in our mission statement, one of the things that we talk about is educating, and that's a really big part of what we're trying to do. But I think actually this podcast kind of fills two roles. Our goal with it, at least, is to educate, but also that community aspect. We hope that people will engage with the conversations that we're having. And we're just going to dig into a little bit of what the Worship Collective is and kind of like what particular focus when it comes to education we have. And so I want to start by just sharing the story for anybody who doesn't know, or maybe just a refresher for people who do, of how the Worship Collective started. So we started in 2019 as sort of an informal network, just kind of a grassroots movement of worship leaders. And the goal was simple. We wanted to get people together from different denominations that normally wouldn't worship together, get them in the same room and worship, promote unity in the body of Christ. And so one thing about the Worship Collective is it is ecumenical, just meaning accepting of all the different Christian denominations and traditions and wanting to bring them together and recognize that we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. That was at the heart of what we did from the very, very beginning. In the first 3 years of us existing, I started to see some concerning trends. A lot of the worship leaders that started with us, by the end of 3 years, they were not doing it anymore. And that ranged from a variety of reasons. For some people, it was just they had another kid and realized that working in the church wasn't enough, and they needed to switch jobs, or they moved. But there was also a lot going on in the church at the time that was very disappointing. There was a lot of, and when I say this, I'm not just talking about like in our community, in our area. We've all heard about the documentaries about the different churches and the worship teams and the pastors, all these like moral failings and these downfalls. My point is that was happening on a global scale, on people talking about it in documentaries and on the news, and on a local level. Like, it was everywhere, and people were experiencing that and are still experiencing it. We even have some more recent ones and very prominent worship movements that like hit really close to home for a lot of people. And I noticed this trend, and it was very discouraging, and I was concerned about it. And I also noticed at the same time, working in youth ministry with high school students, this real hunger from that age group, that demographic of wanting to lead worship and dig deeper. And so we did our first student-led worship night in 2021, which was also the same year that we started the nonprofit and kind of became an official organization rather than just this grassroots movement. And that first student-led worship night where we had high schoolers leading and we really encouraged them to jump into it was, for me, a wake-up call. Like, this is it. Like, it was the first time I did youth ministry and worship ministry at the same time, and I really saw like my passion being there. And the burden that I had was these students need a better foundation than the generation that came before them. Like, we got to dig deeper, not just of musical skills and leadership skills, but like a real in-depth theology of worship. And what they call this in an academic sense is worship renewal. The idea of having rich, holistic worship in the church that's theologically based, that's rooted in ancient worship practices, so church history, but also moving forward, aware of our modern context and able to sort of adapt. Robert Weber, who's sort of the father of worship renewal, if you will, is a scholar who wrote and taught a lot of amazing stuff in this field. And I'm currently going to school at Institute for Worship Studies, which is a grad school that he started, and he called this ancient future worship. That was the concept. It's rooted in the past, in our traditions and the things that have been handed down to us, but looking towards the future. And so I realized as I continued in my studies that this isn't talked about usually until the doctoral level, sometimes at the master's level. But most people, even if they're getting a worship-focused 4-year degree, aren't going to get this stuff. And so we're really trying to bring like pretty rigorous academic seminary level stuff for these students. And one of the things that we've realized along the way is that a lot of worship leaders need this too, like current worship leaders. It's not just, we're going to give these people a foundation. That doesn't mean we just leave all these other people in the dust when, so many conversations I'm having. A lot of worship leaders didn't even go to seminary. And our next episode is going to be about schooling and ministry. We're going to talk about that a little bit. But we want to bring that, make it accessible to people, and bring it as an early of an age as possible, but also accessible. So we're going to talk about some of these sort of seminary level ideas that don't often get talked about, of really digging into a theology of worship. On this show, we're going to get really practical as well, and I'm super excited about it. So here we are. Before I dig into sort of the definition of worship renewal and understanding that, because like I said, that's sort of the academic field of study that we would look at for what our focus is as the worship collective. What is worship renewal? That's what I want to talk about today. And really, in our mission statement, when I talk about enriching the church through worship education, that's that's worship renewal. But not a lot of people are familiar with that term, so I didn't put that term in the mission statement because it might confuse some people. But I like it. I think it's cool, and we're going to talk about it. But do you have any thoughts about kind of like our history, and even you becoming more of a part of it this past year, like anything you'd like to add before I get into that definition?
Yeah, I mean, I jumped in, I don't remember quite when it was, maybe September or October, and hearing, like, I basically got the rundown from you of what you just shared over lunch, and as you were talking about it, I just remember, like, I remember all of the boxes just being checked of like, oh yeah, like we're in this, like this.
Yeah.
You said like the first student-led worship night that you did was the first time that you combined like the youth ministry hat and the worship hat together, right? Mm-hmm. And like that's what I've done since 2019, really, probably even before that, but since 2019 mainly, and like just at my home church, and like that being heavily involved in the youth worship team. We're blessed to have a couple of really awesome kids that run it and do, just are phenomenal. But like working that side of it, it's exactly what you said. It's working them to have a heart for the Lord and to start building a theology that is practical to use, right? And enables them to worship more effectively and to lead people more effectively, both together, right?
Yeah.
And like as you talked about all of that when we were at lunch that day, I remember I was hooked probably, 2 or 3 points in. It was like, oh yeah, like we're gonna get into this. Yeah. So I'm super passionate about the student side of things. Like that's really my sweet spot, and like I would consider myself more student led first, and then like the worship stuff comes alongside of it. Even though I started in worship before I started in student ministry, but when they combine, it's my favorite thing. Yeah. Because I don't know, there's just like a real zeal that I've found with the kids that I work with, and a purity for the Lord that they really I don't have any at church, nor are there any in the worship collective that are here for the wrong reason. Like they're here to lead, they're here to minister to the Lord, and they're here to spend time with Him. And like that's that. There's no ego, there's no performance. It's pure, and I enjoy that.
Yeah. Yeah, for context, we both work in the local church. So we're big proponents of local church. You know, like I both lead worship and the youth ministry at Church by the Sea. I've been leading worship vocationally for about 5 years now, and more recently have gotten into local church youth ministry, but was doing campus ministry long before that. Yeah. So I've always had a heart for students, and I have a huge heart for the local church. And I've even gotten the feedback sometimes. I think this is always kind of a question when there's parachurch organizations, like, well, we don't need you. You think
yeah.
we're not doing our job, you know?
Yeah.
And so I've gotten some like, well, it's the local church's job to disciple, people in worship. And my sarcastic response that I have to keep internal is, yeah, but you're not doing it. Not everybody, but a lot of times it's just not happening.
Sure.
And we can talk about why another time. But secondly, I truly believe, and I think you find this when you start to dig into the idea of worship renewal, that we are going to learn more if we have a variety of perspectives.
Yeah.
And so the benefit of a network, of a parachurch organization, is that you're not just learning from your denomination. You're not just learning from your tradition. You're learning, and so that's where the unity and the education part come together.
Yep.
So that unity piece that started us hasn't left. Just because we've kind of shifted our focus to training and discipling, that heart for all denominations and traditions to work together is still huge for us. And I think you benefit greatly from learning in a context with other believers.
Yep.
So jumping into the idea of worship renewal, it's a call for a more holistic worship experience in the local church that, like I said earlier, it's rooted in ancient Christian practice, but it's looking forward. So when we talk about being rooted in ancient practice, a lot of the early church did utilize different forms of liturgy. And listen, every church has liturgy. I feel like that's a whole other episode. What is liturgy? It's the work of the people. It's your order of service. For those worship leaders listening, it's your planning center, order, right? It's the plan that you make for your worship service. That's what liturgy is. A lot of times when people hear the word liturgy, they think Catholic, Anglican, Episcopalian, like these high church traditions, as they call them, that are very formal,
rigid,
follow maybe like a book that has written prayers and all these things. And we do see a lot of that in the early church. And so there is an element of it that's, yes, a call for order. But also, Lester Ruth is an author in this area that has a lot of great stuff. And he wrote a book, it's a few different authors, but he edited a book called Flow, which talks about the fact that in the earliest descriptions we have of Christian worship in church history, even though there were written prayers and there was a structure and an order of service, there was a lot of extemporaneous, a lot of spontaneous stuff that was going on. And so there's an element of order and flow. And when we have an order down, that actually frees us up to sort of flow a little bit more.
Yep.
What worship renewal is pointing out as a problem that needs to be fixed is when church becomes some songs and a sermon. And that's it.
Yeah.
And for so many modern churches, that's it. And even how we pick our songs is pretty simplistic. It's what's the tempo? We need a couple fast songs and a slow song after the sermon that'll make people sad while we do the offering and ask people to pray or whatever. And we come in, we have a motivational TED Talk, and let's go. Whereas Worship Renewal is saying, no, and also the other thing Worship Renewal comes against is the idea that worship is just music.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think for a lot of people when they hear worship, they think music. And when we're doing the songs in the service, that's worship, and then there's preaching and the other stuff. And it's like, no, we're saying everything that happens in a gathered setting of believers is worship.
Yeah.
From the prayer to the sermon to the music to communion, all of these things. And worship renewal is a call to recognize that and to plan accordingly. Let's pick songs that serve the text. Let's make sure that whether it's communion or something else, there's an opportunity to respond to the message. And so it's a little bit of a call. This might scare some preachers to say maybe the sermon is not the pinnacle of the Sunday morning experience. Maybe there's more to it than that. Maybe it's one very important part of the Sunday experience, but there's other things that are equally as important that have sort of gone to the wayside.
Well, it's even the other side too, right? Like you can hold that towards worship leaders too. You can hold that towards ministry or prayer teams at the end of service. Like you can hold it in any part. Like when I don't want to say as a hard fast rule when one is like carried heavier than the other, emphasized more than the other, that it's out of order. But I do like it isn't more important to like you're saying, make a cohesive plan through the whole thing and see the whole service as one body of work versus like you said, 15 minutes here, we're gonna do 30 here, and then we'll do 15 at the end. We'll be done less than an hour. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
it's less about the checklist and more about accomplishing the goals throughout all parts of it.
Yeah. Most worship renewalists talk about a fourfold worship gathering. And it starts with gathering. Okay, so a call to worship, we're going to kind of set things up. Word, which can be scripture readings, the sermon, songs that are carried by scripture. And then table, which is communion. Most worship renewalists are advocates for weekly communion. I certainly am. Again, probably another episode. But if you don't have weekly communion, how are you going to respond to the message?
Sure.
Because most people, it's sing a song and leave.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to give people more than that to respond to the word. And then the sending. Okay, so rather than just, okay, go beat the Baptist to lunch, your little catchphrase. No, how are we going to, this is still a holy moment. This is still a part of worship. How are we going to send people? And so, gathering, word, table, sending. What you notice about that is there is a structure to that, but so many things can fall in all four of those categories.
Right.
And a lot of worship renewals will also say, I think of that book Flow, but also The Worship Architect by Dr. Constance, another really good book I highly recommend, is the idea that it should vary from week to week. In fact, having this order of service in mind actually gives you a lot of freedom. Because in one week, table and sending might have music, and another week it might have a prayer or the Apostles' Creed, and another week you can put so many different things in these, but as long as you're making sure you're hitting this kind of fourfold thing that we've seen Christians doing since the very beginning of the church, kind of following that pattern. And that's really important, is like worship renewal doesn't discriminate against a denomination. It's for all Christians. And it actually encourages that sort of diversity in worship practice and tradition and thought. Some people will think, oh, you want us to all be Catholic, or you want us to all be Anglican. No, like you can be Pentecostal or Baptist or Presbyterian or Methodist or whatever, but these are principles that apply to any denomination, any worship style. Worship renewal doesn't favor a style of music.
Yeah.
It can be hymns, it can be contemporary, it doesn't matter. These principles apply and they're helpful. And so... I think people knowing that their tradition, their style of music, all that stuff, that's up for grabs, but we lost a lot of really important kind of structure along the way. And so that's sort of the idea. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
I think so.
Okay.
I think the 2 points ago is really interesting to me. You said something about hitting like the four categories, the four the fourfold parts of the Christian service, but hitting them in different ways, right? Mm-hmm. And so like I know at my church it's the same structure every week, and that's fine, but I do find myself sometimes wanting to change it. And I even like in youth ministry, which I'm the pastor of, like I'm like, oh boy, we should probably like switch things up a bit. I'm okay with the structure. I even like students especially being able to anticipate what we're going to do next, because it helps us move faster. But sometimes I do enjoy the switch up to maybe not let things get stale, because I think one of maybe the underlying point to all of this is that we treat service as pedestrian, right? From either a leader's position or a congregant's position. And that's honestly the pitfall that is before us, is when we treat gathering as a community as pedestrian, as an everyday thing, and as not sacred or not special or not unique or not purposeful, we miss it, and we miss the point, and it becomes casual, and it becomes thin, and that's a failure, and that's something that obviously we're looking to right that, right? And so the thing about like the structure and what you're saying in the fourfold, like you can switch things up and still accomplish the main goal, right? And maybe if you're looking to like if you're looking to keep people on their toes a little bit, to not let the gathering get stale or get regular or ordinary. Like, that's a way to do it, right?
Well, what it does is it forces you to ask, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times we just do it because, this is what we do. This is what we do.
That's what we've always done.
But this encourages you to make sure you're not placing anything in there without a purpose.
Yeah.
And I think to sort of drive this home is the question that we want to set out to answer today is, what is worship renewal? Worship renewal is a call to worship leaders. That means not just music leaders, but lead pastors, preachers, everybody that's involved in crafting the Sunday morning experience to be more intentional. Worship renewal is a call to be more intentional.
Yeah.
That's it. And so we're going to get, as we continue doing this, really practical. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can find more information about us on worshipcollective.net. And we encourage you to give this a listen and follow us for more conversations. I'm really excited about this, and I hope it's helpful to those who listen.
You mentioned some bomb books too. We should link those.
Yeah, so we're going to, we'll have a link to all the books that we mentioned in the description. I encourage you to use that link specifically. That might help us a little bit. But yeah, we'll have Amazon links to all the books, and that will continue to be a thing. So if you hear us say something in the episode, check the description later to see. I encourage you to read some of these on your own. Especially out of all of them, the Worship Architect I recommend the most because it is so practical. It gives you lots of ideas of things that could go in those 4 categories and why we should use those 4 categories. Very helpful. So, thank you for listening, and we'll continue this conversation soon.